A warm welcome to everyone. This is your Energy Frontiers for the week. I am Justina Okechukwu. Here are some of the biggest headlines across the African energy markets. A new report by the World Bank Group estimates that investing an average of 1.4% of GDP annually could reduce emissions in developing countries by as much as 70% by the year 2050 and boost resilience. The International Energy Agency has warned in its latest World Energy Outlook that Europe needs to take immediate action to avoid the risk of natural gas shortage of up to 30 billion cubic meters next year. In the meantime, a coalition of African and European civil society organizations have warned the EU and heads of state that a dash for gas in Africa would be a disaster for the climate, while undermining Europe's existing commitments to phase out international finance for oil and gas as promised in Glasgow at COP26 last year. Moody's Investor Service has raised its outlook on Eskom's bond to positive from negative, the first since 2007. This comes after South Africa's Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, said the government could take over a substantial portion of Eskom's 400 billion rand debt. Next on Energy Frontiers, we get insights into global oil outlook from OPEC's new reports. This is Energy Frontiers. Welcome back to the program. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries in the week launched the 2022 World Oil Outlook at the ADIPEC summit held in Abu Dhabi. The new report projected global oil demand to increase to around 110 million barrels per day in 2045, while investment for oil and gas is estimated at $12.1 trillion over the period. Here is an excerpt from a panel of distinguished industry professionals, including the head of OPEC itself, that reviews the new Outlook reports.
Clearly oil is part of the energy mix in terms of the transition. But where do you see, will the energy crisis, I suppose, accelerate the energy transition in the short, medium, long term? Have you taken that into consideration in the report?
Yes, exactly. In the report, we have some revisions as mentioned by the Qahtani and also by His Excellency. The revisions are for delay on certain policies, because we see also in Europe some switching from oil, from coal to oil using in power generation. And also when we talk now about energy security, I see just a few hours a panel discussion on the priorities in Europe. And last year in the same event at ADIPEC, we were talking about net zero, but this year we are talking about energy security. And we talk about energy security, that means all energy sources will be needed in the future. And with this effect, we expect in our outlook that we will see some delay in implementation of certain policies.
Dr. Yan, many other forecasting houses might be looking at oil demand peaking within the next 10 to 15 years. I'm looking at your report, and you're looking at the plateau in global oil demand in the mid-2030s. Talk to me a little bit about why you think that that's the situation.
We have in our projections, we have oil demand growing in the next 10 years quite significantly, and then basically plateauing over the long term. And I think that a similar pattern you have in also with many other institutions. I don't think that we are the only institution that have this pattern or this profile for the oil demand, especially if you look at the base case projections. Of course, if you have some target-oriented scenarios, then the pattern could be significantly different. But for the reference cases, many institutions have a similar pattern. Now, whether we should change it or should we have a demand peaking maybe? Are we behind the curve maybe in this respect? I don't think so, because when we, or I would say, what is the decision? The most important factor in this respect is, to me, the implementation of the policies. How far you go with the policy factor in the projections. In developed countries, as we have seen in the presentation of Dr. Katani, in OECD countries, there is a significant, or demand will start declining quite soon, and there is a significant decline, more than 10 million barrels per day in the long term. But what drives the demand and compensates for this decline are the developments in non-OECD countries, in developing countries, Africa, India, Asia, and so on. And this is what drives the demand and leads to the pattern where still the demand will likely grow over the entire forecast period.
Dr. Al-Kazimi, talk to me about Russian supply, because many people see it really falling perhaps lower than what you're looking at the EU embargo and the product imports. And talk to me a little bit, where do you see Russian supply in the coming years?
Contrary to analysts' initial assessment, we look at it from different perspective, or more broader perspective, where Russia's supply dropped by 400,000 barrels from the first quarter of this year, from 11.3 million barrels per day to slightly less than 11 million barrels per day in the third quarter. With that being said, we are factoring in further decline over the medium term before a long-term recovery.
Thank you. And Julius, just, on the report as well, you infer that OPEC liquid supply will rise by 10 million barrels a day in the long term. And again, this demands a lot of investment. I mean, do you think that the member countries, are ready to make this investment to ensure that the output can actually rise this high?
Well, when we talk about $12 trillion being needed provide the supply of oil we need by 2045, we're not just directing that to non-OPEC countries, we're directing that to all stakeholders globally. This is a responsibility for OPEC member countries too as well to invest. And indeed, we see that in most OPEC member countries, there are either plans underway to invest in new capacity and other facilities for oil, or there are plans to attract investment. And I think we heard this morning some of the very best examples for OPEC countries investing in their own capacity in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and here in the United Arab Emirates, where significant investments are being made to increase capacity. So while OPEC member countries retain some of the cheapest and cleanest oil resources in the world, we are confident that these investments will be made in OPEC member countries too.
Okay, I want to give the Secretary General the closing word, but Mr. Al-Khattani, first, if I could quickly just say to you, secure, affordable, sustainable. You're very much in line with the theme of this conference, which, you had in place before you came. Just again, why are these issues so important? And I'm sure you're probably already working on the report for next year as well, bringing your team together.
Because it's sound and it's logic. You have to have it affordable, secure, and acceptable for it to cater to the doubling of the global economy. I just leave you with that thought. Doubling the global economy size between now and 2045, that's a lot of work. To double the global economy, reaching north of $230 trillion by 2045. If we are to do that, we will need to cater to it a lot of energy. But we are quite bold on our assumption when it comes to the energy intensity. We're only assuming global energy demand is to grow by only 23%. There is a lot of energy efficiency. But how do we do that? That's the trick. And I think the WU offers a lot of valuable insight. How can you attend to that rather very responsibly and very much in line with the theme of today's conference?
Indeed, yes. I think, Your Excellency, again, huge investment is needed. You need to keep all of the countries together to make sure, because that is probably our best hope in terms of investment. But where's the sort of near-term future, the next year or two? What's the big focus for you?
Well, big focus, number one, definitely is, as you said, to keep this group together. Yes, the group is united. We stand together. We have a noble cause towards, as my colleague said, stimulating global economic growth through making available, affordable, and sustainable and secure supplies of oil. And this is what OPEC's been doing for 62 years since it was created, and we will continue to do this for years to come. This is our mission, this is our objective. The world needs oil, the world needs fuel, to grow and the economy to grow. And we have 2 billion people almost in terms of population growth. So they will definitely need access to affordable, sustainable, and secure energy. And OPEC has done that for years. We will continue to do that.
When we return, we'll turn our attention to Global Center on Adaptation and its new report on Africa. Welcome back. I am Justina Okechukwu. The Global Center on Adaptation on Thursday unveiled its 2022 State and Trends on Adaptation in Africa report. The new study reveals that Africa is facing a crisis in funding for climate adaptation. It added that by 2030, cumulative adaptation finance will fall less than a quarter. At the launch were high-profile speakers, including United Nations and African Development Bank Group. Let's listen to them.
So today, I do not need to repeat to you that Africa is the continent with the greatest vulnerability to climate change. We have all seen the devastation climate change is already causing in the region, from the floods striking Niger, Sudan, South Sudan, and Mali, to the persistent drought in the Horn of Africa, and the 3 strong tropical cyclones smashing into Mozambique and other southern African countries. And we must make it clear that adaptation is not a choice. It's not a choice. It is a necessity. Either we adapt or we die. So let me highlight 3 key messages. 1, adaptation is indispensable to solving the food crisis in Africa. 2, while much more financing is needed for adaptation, it's also an economically smart investment for the region. It's smart economics. And 3, adaptation must be everybody's business, not only the government's. So let's turn to message 1. Africa is urgently tackling its food crisis. And the world must help. And climate adaptation must be part of these solutions. Last year in State and Trends 2021, we calculated that the cost of leaving climate adaptation aside in agriculture would be more than $200 billion annually. However, the cost of action is less than 1/10 of that amount. An adapted agriculture sector only needs $15 billion a year investment. So in this year's report, we deepened our analysis of food system in Africa. The State and Trends in African Adaptation 2022, it looks at livestock, fisheries, and agroforestry. Let me just zoom in on livestock. Why? Because livestock accounts for 55% of household income in pastoralist communities. So what is climate change going to do to livestock in Africa? Well, heat stress alone will cause between 15 and 40 billion of losses every year. And families that rely on livestock can't afford these losses. So the solutions, they exist, from breeding and pest management programs to climate adapted land management and climate smart digital solutions that help herders and farmers make the right choices. The solutions to the food crisis in Africa must include decisive, fast, at scale adaptation action in crops, livestock, fisheries, and agroforestry. Let me turn to the second message of the report. Well, much more financing is needed for adaptation. It is an economically smart investment for the region. The SDA report this year shows the numerous solutions and practical African experiences that already exist and have proven effective in adapting to a rapidly changing climate. So what is missing here? One big gap is funding, is financing for adaptation. Current annual spending on adaptation across Africa is how much? $11 billion a year, which is about 40% of all climate finance for the continent. So meeting the goals in countries' NDCs would require an additional $41 billion annually. So the financing gap a year is over $40 billion US dollars. In addition to this, what is a great concern to us in GSCA is that of the $11 billion which is flowing today, more than 97% came from public actors. Hence, with less than 3% was tracked from the private sector. This is less than $250 million between 2019 and 2020. Let me conclude with my third message of the report. Adaptation must be everybody's business. The private sector, communities, cities, and of course, the government must be part of the solution. Our survey of African medium and small enterprises shows the dramatic impact of climate change today. They told us that 75% saw a decrease in productivity, and over 70% saw a reduction in sales and incomes. The good thing, the flip side is the private sector is also providing innovative solutions. Through our Youth Adapt program, which we hold together with the African Development Bank, we are supporting creative entrepreneurs with locally grown adaptation solutions.
First and foremost is that Africa is not responsible for the global climate change. Africa only contributes 3% of the global emissions, but suffers disproportionately from the negative impacts of it. I feel that myself. It's not just even, let's leave the numbers alone. I went to Cabo Verde, and when I traveled over there, they had not had rain in almost 5 years. In fact, my arriving there was the same day that they actually had rain. And you can imagine, you can see a lot of it in terms of increased droughts, increased flood. You can see it in increased level of heat that you have that is actually affecting crops. The International Panel for Climate Change shows very clearly that what's going to happen is Africa will warm up faster than any other region of the world. And that's, of course, going to affect significantly crop output production, livestock production, and that will really significantly reduce incomes and livelihoods for farmers that form the majority of the population in Africa. So today, Africa gets only 3% of global climate finance, which is disproportionate to the needs that actually Africa has. Today, Africa is losing $7 to $15 billion a year because of climate change. And if actions are not taken rapidly, that will grow to $50 billion a year by 2030. Our economies cannot continue to be stymied, and our livelihoods of Africans are put at risk because of climate change. Let's be clear what this report does. In addition to what we have actually done at also the African Development Bank in partnership with the Global Center for Adaptation, we know that Africa's needs to meet its climate actions under Paris Agreement and to be able to also do climate financing is between $1.3 to $1.6 trillion by 2030. That brings the total value average to about $127 billion a year in climate finance. And yet, Africa gets only $18 billion in climate finance. So that leaves a balance of $110 billion in climate finance per year for Africa. So, Vakrijan was just talking about the importance of the developed countries to pay up the $100 billion that was promised per year to developing countries to tackle climate change. Well, here is my own message. What Africa actually needs is has a financing gap of $110 billion a year. That is more than even the $100 billion that we are talking about. Now, this report talks a lot about climate adaptation, which is Africa's main challenge, is adaptation. If you take, for example, how much we will need for climate adaptation for Africa, we have in this report a balance of anything about almost $41, $42 billion just for climate adaptation per year that we must mobilize. Now, we have been our part in doing that. We are not just folding our hands. The African Development Bank is, together with the Global Center for Adaptation, we launched the African Adaptation Acceleration Program, which is Africa's largest effort. In fact, I must say, it's the largest effort globally to tackle the issue of adaptation, climate adaptation. It's to raise $25 billion to support African countries to tackle climate adaptation.
Current annual spending on adaptation in Africa amounts to $11.4 billion, approximately 39% of total climate finance that is committed to the continent annually. This is a far cry from the $43.1 billion per year that is required to implement the nationally determined contributions for African countries. COP27 must be a turning point. Developed countries must put forward credible plans to double adaptation finance to reach $40 billion a year by 2025. The Secretary General has called for a new business model to deliver adaptation finance by turning adaptation priorities into pipelines of investable projects, as outlined in the Adaptation Pipeline Accelerator. In the medium to long term, we need to work towards stronger and more efficient country systems. This means, first, effective and transparent institutions able to lead country responses that are tailored to adaptation challenges. Second, comprehensive and inclusive policy frameworks that guide partnerships with the private sector and drive African innovations. And third, greater domestic resource mobilization from public and private sources to complement international climate finance provided by developed countries.
And that's the package of the show for the week, and we hope you enjoyed it. Remember to follow Energy Frontiers on Frontier Africa Reports website and across all our social media handles as indicated on the screen. It's goodbye from me, Justina Okechukwu, and I'll see you next time.